So we're back to Cracks in Postmodernity with John Milbank, who I'm very excited to have on today. So, John, tell us a little bit about your background, your scholarly work, and then about the Radical Orthodoxy project.
Well, I had quite a mixed kind of academic formation. I started off by being a historian, which has probably continued to have an influence on me. And then I studied theology, and then I studied philosophy and went back to theology. And then my first post was to do with Christian social thought. And that steered me in a particular direction that's been one of the dominant themes for me. Radical Orthodoxy really emerged amongst some academics and students in Cambridge University in the 1990s. And I suppose it developed from a feeling that the agenda for theology was always set from outside theology, with the assumption that theology in various ways had to fit into frameworks created elsewhere, with the feeling that even apparently trends that would resist that, like Barthian neo-orthodoxy, in reality weren't contesting a philosophical framework, and that they still had a kind of fideistic response to a modern philosophical framework. So we were in a way contesting boundaries and suggesting that a lot of the conclusions of other disciplines are not theologically innocent, which I'd already been trying to do in my book that I finished at Lancaster, Theology and Social Theory. So that we're confronted often with quasi-theologies or with outright anti-theologies, even when secular thought appears to be, in some sense, neutral. This definitely doesn't mean that we're trying to, as it were, deduce everything from theology. That would be an absurd conclusion, because theology itself is a very analogical, fragmentary, negative discourse that's always built up from the extension of other discourses. But I suppose we were looking for a space where those discourses have a certain kind of open-endedness, contesting the idea that they are necessarily finite, or that the finite defines a critical space, or you can readily define the bounds of licit over against illicit discourse. And that made us very naturally sympathetic to theologians of the Nouvelle Theology who contested the idea that there is a sharp boundary between the natural and the supernatural, or between grace and reason. And then I suppose, two other things to mention would be, first of all, that we were operating against a background of the influence of poststructuralism and postmodernism, and to some extent a kind of Wittgensteinian skepticism, if you're talking in more analytic terms, suggesting that everything is fluid or everything is only linguistic, and the danger that we're heading towards completely skeptical or nihilistic conclusions. And one response to that is to return to some kind of foundationalism in philosophy, and to return to some kind of humanism in terms of values. Whereas we were suggesting that a different response would be to recover the sense of the strong link of theology to a broadly Neoplatonic tradition that sees everything in terms of participation. And that by doing that, one can rethink the fragmentary and temporal and linguistic character of everything more as pointing towards the infinite in a stuttering kind of way, sort of escaping skepticism without returning to some kind of immanent foundationalism. And I think perhaps it's fair to say that since that time, secular thought, where it hasn't gone in a completely nihilistic or skeptical direction, we can talk about this a bit later, has returned to one form or another of speculation. And you could say, in a sense, that radical orthodoxy was one of the first movements to do that, to try to return to a metaphysics in a rather, metaphysical kind of sense. So, not to retreat simply to philosophy of language or simply phenomenology, the philosophy of appearances. I think one should rather say that everything is about appearances and everything is about articulation, but neither are complete in themselves. And just for that reason, there is a speculative dimension to thoughts, if it's going to be realist, whether about things in this world or about God. But that doesn't preclude a certain mystical idea that we are somehow, through our speculation, seeing beyond what we can normally see. I think this is one reason why Nicholas of Cusa has been so important within radical orthodoxy, his link between the mystical on the one hand and the conjectural on the other hand. And then I think the second thing to say is, and this has probably become more important as time has gone on, that we've wanted to see radical orthodoxy not simply as meaning that orthodoxy is actually the most radical and critical thing you can imagine, which we certainly do think, but that sometimes orthodoxy itself needs radicalizing. In other words, that those thinkers who've most pressed the paradoxes of Christian theology, and that would include the paradox, the natural desire for the supernatural, but if you like, all the paradoxes to do with the relationship between the creator and the creation, and the paradoxical implications of Trinitarian and Christological thought. So all those thinkers who sort of pushed that issue, and those thinkers, I would say, who have been concerned to say that the Christian recognition of finitude and plurality is nonetheless not a sort of qualification of monotheism, or even a kind of radical monism, in the sense that everything participates in the one, comes from the one, and returns to the one. But I do feel that there's a sort of resonance between radical orthodoxy and the way that things are going in some other traditions. For example, I feel that the so-called theological turn in French phenomenology is now shifting into more acceptance of the metaphysical, that the closure against the metaphysical is being questioned by the next generation. Yeah. And we're getting to a much more ecumenical situation where we sort of acknowledge the contribution of analytic focus on language and the contribution of phenomenology on intuition and what appears, but you insist that the interplay of those requires the third, if you like, of the speculative.
Yeah, and I see a lot of my own experience reflected in that trajectory, because, as I was saying, when I was in undergrad, I was at a Catholic university, I was studying theology, but there's a heavy emphasis on post-structural thought, to the point that, like you were saying, they're trying to fit these theological categories into the post-structural categories, using it on its terms, not on the theology's terms, not looking at these metaphysical concepts on their own terms. And I didn't really have any tools to make sense of that. Like this was all I was being given. And it wasn't until, I did a master's at another university in theology. And that's when I was first exposed to people like McIntyre, like Charles Taylor.
Yes,
And I
yes,
saw that there are people who are looking at secularism and asking, well, what is this and what are the categories that this has spawned? Because
yes.
it's not neutral as much as it claims to be. It's not absolute. Where did these categories, these ideas come from? And I think it was a conference I went to where William T. Kavanaugh spoke. And I decided to pick up a copy of Torture in the Eucharist. And that's where I think he mentions you, theology and social theory. And I think what really resonated there is that, you're taking a lot of these post-structuralist thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, and you're taking, I guess, this hermeneutic of doubt, of skepticism, and flipping it on its head, saying, well, where do these categories you're using even come from? Like, where, it's like you're taking the skeptical attitude that they have and then using
Yes.
it to critique what they're saying, because again, it's like they don't have any claim to neutrality, and nor does theology, of course. But if we're
No.
going to create, if we're going to treat post-structuralism as if it can serve as the basis, the foundation of a university education, which I saw in my experience that was happening, we have to have we have to have reasons to do so. And if it's not
Yeah.
neutral, if there aren't adequate reasons, then why is this becoming the norm? you know
Mm.
and I know you're saying now, I think a lot of younger people, especially my generation, are skeptical about that, because we recognize there's a need for the metaphysical. Without that, like, our culture is impoverished, we fall into despair. um
Yes.
so I hope we can be optimistic and say that there's a shift. But I definitely see the consequences. There are definitely repercussions of using only this skeptical kind of narrative and not asking, well, what is real, what is true?
Yes. I mean, I think, it's possible to see a certain depth to the post-structuralist moment insofar as it was deconstructing foundationalism. It was getting rid of the dominance of epistemology and the model of representation, and the idea that we can generate things simply out of a kind of a priori given humanism. So that I think it did an important negative work. But then the next stage was to see that it's still putting up a new kind of transcendentalist framework that's supposed to be fundamental. The idea that we are totally trapped within language, and semiotics is always postponement, and so on. And I think that since then there's been a deeper and further questioning of humanism in secular thought. A realization that it's rather strange to say that we're trapped within various forms of cultural bounds, as if we weren't all also natural creatures. And so, as you'll know, there's this sort of reaction towards a kind of speculative realism that involves an even further questioning of the the normativity of Kant, the idea that we can only, as it were, know our own thoughts in the end. And I think this is one of the reasons for the turn against phenomenology, or the idea that we can only know the finite, a sense that maybe Kant isn't really fully in keeping with either natural science or the conclusions of mathematics. Besides the earlier idea that he's not really taking account of language, which is already mixed up intuition with intellection, and he's not really taking account of the body, which means that before we're looking at the world trying to know it, we're already part of the world, and our knowledge of the world is only part of our interaction with the world. And yet the irony is that even in secular terms, Kant may not be ultimately normative. There can be other, so theologies, by playing this try to fit in game, it then gets wrong-footed when the name of the secular game changes,
Yeah.
and you now have to confront a much more radical speculative naturalism, and in a way, then you can play you can make it much more of a straight metaphysical fight nowadays. And I think radical orthodoxy hasn't been alone, but I think it's been one of the movements that's prepared us much more for that kind of moment, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to go a little bit more into now the cultural repercussions of this kind of battle, as you're saying, because I think there was an article you wrote in The Guardian, I believe, about transgenderism and the kind of class conflict implicated in it.
Mm.
And it was helpful for me because I think that was the first time I saw articulated that these ideas that are born out of post-structural thought, which are very much removed from a phenomenological awareness of the body, of human experience, they're very much abstracted from reality, and serve to benefit those who are for lack of a better term, elites, people who are college educated, who have, enough financial resources. There isn't as much at stake for them. Whereas for working class, ethnic people, people of color, this kind of worldview that's uprooted from the real, from the body, from nature, from natural law, like there are consequences when you buy into these ideas, when relativism has a cost, but it's a more prominent cost for those who are not as privileged, we can say.
There are a huge number of things you might say here. What's been happening recently in Canada with the truckers, it's almost as if you've got the physicals versus the virtuals, and I think not to understand why the physicals are angry it is to make a very big mistake. But I think you're putting your finger on it. The sense that there are people for whom concrete and traditional things are their security, and what gives meaning to their lives. So that it's increasingly obvious with this drift of the working class towards the political right, which may not be a good thing at all, but nonetheless, the liberal left does pose very important questions. The sort of the patronizing attitude that kind of working class people only care about the economic situation, for example. They do care about the economic situation, but the idea, precisely because you may not have an enormous amount of economic stuff. I mean, you're not necessarily poor, and precisely because you're not naturally individualistic, what gives meaning to your life is much more something symbolic, if you like, that your cultural identity, your place, your country, a certain ritual pattern of doing things. It's profoundly ironic, especially in Britain, perhaps, that where working class may not be very religiously observant, and yet in a weird kind of way, they have a stronger sense of the religious pattern than a lot of the religious, for whom religion has become something far too kind of abstract and moralistic in a narrow kind of way. And again, I think the traditional left is it's absolutely right to say, I mean, working classes people suffer for reasons of economic depredation because capitalism is unfair. I agree with all that, but they've sort of underrated the degree to which family structures have enabled the working classes to survive, and that strong family, and one sees this so clearly with people like Asians, they enable them to cooperate. From families, you build cooperative communities. You're able to take more control over your own destiny, you know. And some ethnic groups less able to do that. It often is because of family breakdown or breakdown of religious traditions, you know, for both internal and external reasons. And, you know, none of these things have the left taken seriously. And there's a sense in which the over-alliance of socialism with materialism leads to a weird kind of patronizing that you know, again, you know, the base level is the real level, if you like. Yeah. It is a leveling down rather than a leveling up, and a lot of working class actually, it turns out, aspire to a leveling up. And you know, unless you miss that, the risks that you're going to let new kinds of fascism emerge, you know, well, it's already absolutely palpable that I think that, you know, that is the risk.
The working class sensibility that really values, as you said, like the body, the immediate, the real, basic family relations, community, local community kind of relations.
Yeah.
That is being overlooked. That's not really factored into the calculations of corporate power, state power. But I think for me, what's really striking, and again, back to the article that you wrote, their vision of freedom, of, you know, of liberation is totally connected to the power of technology, but also bureaucracy. So in order to be your authentic self, there needs to be a technological intervention. You need to patronize corporate power. Just thinking of like the trans phenomenon, like to be yourself, you have to pay to get these treatments using technology.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, the trans debate is another example of the way in which, you know, theology can be wrong-footed, because it now turns out, you know, there is no secular agreement about this issue. On the contrary, it's within secular feminism itself that you're getting a backlash against that. And with the thought of people like Mary Harrington and so on, this is leading to a quite radical thinking about second wave feminism and how far it was even ever feminist, you know, because it was too much about self-construction and ignoring the biological dimension and the question of the flourishing of women as very specifically women, and as different bodily, that involving a different phenomenology in the way that somebody like Irigaray argued. I mean, French feminism has always been more aware of this kind of thing, but the trajectory of a lot of Anglo-Saxon feminism towards self-construction means you kind of leave the question of being a woman behind altogether. It even gets kind of derogated, you know, and then it leads to this encouragement of the post-human. And I suppose at this point I get slightly confused, because I can see how there is a continuity from the sort of open-ended nihilism of post-structuralism towards the post-human obsession. But on the other hand, I think other aspects of you know, current wokeness and so on, I can't imagine people like Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault liking it at all, because it's far too much like about human rights and an insistence that there are, you know, absolute identities that you can assert, and the idea that you sort of, you know, about yourself and nobody else does. You know, this seems to be not at all in keeping with the critical attitude of post-modernism. So that, you know, one aspect of the current mood is more like a hyper modern liberalism, really. It's sort of liberalism on speed or something. And I think you put your finger on it when you say that there's a kind of alliance between a new sort of unquestioning scientism, which again is not very like the post-structuralists, but a sort of naturalist scientism on the one hand, and on the other saying, well, a very radical subjectivity that is simply about self-assertion and turning yourself into something else, with the complication that it always seems to be also about identifying with a certain group, which are problematically and incoherently supposed to be at once sort of naturally absolute and yet also totally invented, in a way that's completely confusing. And at that point, politics overtakes all philosophy. It seems to be all serious reflection. And the fact that universities don't say this and go into this is an absolute betrayal of what they're supposed to be about,
Yeah, no. And it makes me think of, you're familiar with Augusto Del Noce's work, the Italian political philosopher?
Del Noce, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right from my thesis on Vico onwards, I've been aware of Del Noce, and a very interesting guy who sort of pleads for Southern Latin thought as having its own integrity and importance.
Yeah, because he says in one of the essays that all of these ideologies that really gave way to the revolution, the cultural revolutions of the 60s, had this anti-bourgeois, anti-establishment kind of bent. But inevitably, because they never really took into account any metaphysical categories, never really allowed for space for the transcendent, inevitably they became bourgeois again. So this is what you're saying, that I'm sure Foucault would not be pleased with the current transgender narrative that we're hearing today, but because he left no space for the metaphysical, this is inevitably what happens. As much as he may not agree with the result, you can't avoid this if you're not going to be rooted in something that's eternal, that transcends earthly power, state power, etc.
No, I completely agree with you about that, very much so.
Yeah, but I want to talk more about, I guess, the cultural but also the psychological consequences of this being the kind of prominent narrative being fed to students in universities. Because for me, I think for people coming from comfortable middle class suburban kind of bourgeois settings, going to university, being taught to look at reality this way, for me, at least, speaking from my personal experience, like, it kind of strips you of any possibility of hope or meaning, because you're taught that it's just this battle between different earthly powers. There's nothing that really promises a real lasting meaning in life, other than trying to create a more just social order, which again comes down to brute power, but also
sorry, you're breaking up.
Okay, let me make sure it's connected. Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it clear?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. All right. No, so I was saying, no, I want to look at the cultural and also the psychological consequences of post-structuralism being the kind of main foundation of university education, at least in the humanities. Because for me, I found that for myself, but also others who came from a very comfortable, suburban bourgeois middle class background, you're going into college with these very, I guess, just very sheltered from the realities that other people have to face. Like, you're already given this narrative that, like, reality is benevolent, that as long as you're a good person, you be yourself, everything will work out fine. And then once you get the post-structuralist kind of narrative, then it's like, there's this urge to be part of, being on the right side of whatever social cause. Like, you want to assure that, I don't know, it comes down to this power dynamic that, as long as those who are good, those who are for the right cause, are in power, but also that, you know, you're yourself, you're true to your, you know, this kind of authenticity narrative, everything will be fine. But then after that, it's like, okay, first of all, when am I going to be truly myself? Like, when do I achieve this ideal? It's super abstract, but it's totally disconnected from culture, tradition, family relations, anything larger than myself. And then when it comes to the social reality, it's like, when do we achieve true equality, true liberation? Like, there's no real criterion for making this kind of determination. So what you end up with is this sense of atomization. And
you know, one way of putting it is to say that if the people at the top of the meritocratic hierarchy don't believe in any kind of metaphysical hierarchy or hierarchy of values, then they seem to be adopting a discourse that simply justifies their own power, and even tends to reduce learning to itself to, you know, the struggle for power. And you know, an awful lot of people by now have pointed out how dubious you know, the rule of the meritocrats actually is, that they've become a self-reproducing class, that the education divide is now one of the biggest vote indicators. And we've got this extraordinary situation, unprecedented in history, where the learned class seems to have moved towards the left, even though, you know, their cousins or some of the people who live in a university eventually, you know, move on to the neoliberal right in reality. But you've got this devil's alliance really between a cultural left and an economic right in liberalism. But it's really, in the end, these are, you know, the same group of people. And so we now get this phenomenon of woke capitalism that surely encapsulates this phenomenon. And so, you know, the obsession of the left with, you know, completely middle class issues of identity and self-realization, and you know, the collapse of any really strong concern with the critique of capitalism, or any strong discourse of solidarity, you know, amongst everybody, what is bringing us together in terms of the common good. But what, you know, I mean, one of the ironies of all this is that, you know, humanities have now practically collapsed, you know, where they're not linked in any way to religious traditions and upheld by them, they're vanishing. Because, you know, if all there is to say is an insistence on me and my rights, there's really not a lot of point in studying a lot of difficult books. And, you know, you might as well pursue the topics that are more linked to wealth and success, the STEM subjects that are going to lead you in that direction. So once more, we've got to drift towards scientism and positivism, and yet the reverse face of that is this very extreme subjectivism, and tending clearly in a transhumanist direction, you know, which is only going to mean that in reality, a few human beings are controlling everybody else. But, you know, there's also a tragedy involved here, that, you know, the elite is getting smaller and smaller, that, you know, even most of the people who go to university are going to be proletarianized. They're already being proletarianized. You know, their jobs are being routinized because of digitalization, that they're increasingly not going to earn an awful lot. And, you know, this is why people like Joel Kotkin rightly talk about an apparently neo-feudal situation emerging, you know, where you've got the super rich and their hangers on and everybody else. And there are complicated social divisions that I don't, as yet fully understand. I think that in Britain, we tend to find there's an older working class that have still got houses and very traditional and not very well off, perhaps. But then they've got children who are living a very precarious existence in London, but they're nearer the center of things. And perhaps for that reason, they're attracted towards these woke issues that give them some sort of sense of self-respect and who they are. It's a bit like tattooing. It's the kind of political, cultural equivalent of that.
Yeah.
One of we need a kind of politics that can somehow find a way of bringing together the perilous situation of those people, and also a lot of immigrant communities in metropolitan areas who are basically exploited, but they're sort of patronized by a middle class who's apparently concerned with race issues and not at all with, the poor white issues at the margins. We need to find a way of cutting through the new way in which our official capitalist liberal politics is dividing people from each other. And I think none of the current discourses know how to do that or practice it.
Yeah. And my fear, though, is that in the midst of all this kind of chaos and confusion, there are such great psychological consequences for the young people who buy into these kinds of ideas, because again, it's like my fear is the kind of radical atomization, whether it's from being disconnected from other people, but also from ideas, from values that really give life meaning. And I don't know, I see it in things like the performative activism, like you said, it's like a tattoo. It's a way to project your insecurity, your lack of existential certainty in life onto these issues outside of yourself, so that you can be distracted from the fact that you don't know where your value comes from or what gives your life meaning. You see it in the victimization narratives. They're like, sure, I mean, there are plenty of real injustices, real oppression that people suffer, but when we kind of turn to these victim narratives of like, let's point the finger at someone else rather than addressing it in a realistic way, it's not liberating.
It can't be a good situation where the alternatives are, you fail and you cast yourself as a victim, or you simply pursue an incredibly narcissistic kind of success. And all the role models that young people are presented with, suggest the latter. There's no middle path offered there of a decent self-fulfillment in solidarity with other people. And the only ideal ever seems to be social mobility, and of course that has collapsed as well. So the now the only options are superstardom or victimage. But social mobility doesn't seem enough either. We need people at every level of society, and everybody's roles have to be made as fulfilling as possible, and there must be dignity in all necessary human roles. Otherwise, nobody should be performing them. Otherwise, it's a kind of slavery. I mean, we go on and on and on about slavery in the past, and we don't recognize not just the real slavery, but the quasi-slavery that exists in the present. At least Marx was aware of that. But the risk is we're all becoming enslaved now, I think, in different ways. And psychological damage, yes. I mean, there is a so-called epidemic of mental illness, but increasingly, at least in Britain, psychiatrists are very uncertain about the category of mental illness. I mean, isn't it much more that people are in radical distress and that their so-called illnesses are completely coherent reactions to the intolerable, of people who are very sensitive?
Yeah, no, and I feel like even these ploys for, quote unquote mental health awareness, like of course, there are real mental illnesses that need to be taken seriously, but I feel like it's becoming this mask for the fact that people are you know, reasonably disillusioned with the kind of cultural norms today, don't really find space to breathe, to be human, and and then we chalk it up to mental health issues when really it's people are very sane. It's just that the culture,
Absolutely,
you know.
absolutely.
So then what is the solution? Is it I don't know, is it again, it's the solution is you have to pay an expert, someone who's, worked their way up in the meritocratic uh and one of these people who are high up in amongst the elites, and you have to pay to cure whatever your problem is. It's I don't know, it's very deceptive that this narrative of like, uplifting the oppressed, of liberation, always has to include something that gives corporate power more profit, or that
Yeah,
patronizes the state, the bureaucracy. And I think it
yeah,
goes back to what you're saying, that there's this disconnect between I don't know, it's just this understanding of solidarity as something that takes into account real social needs, but
absolutely.
also the human element of relation,
I mean,
community.
I think I mean, I think it's interesting, that psychiatrists themselves are becoming, in a way, skeptical about their own profession, because I think on the one hand, these issues are really social and relational. They can't be solved on the couch. And on the other hand, to the degree to which they are genuinely psychological and not just to do with the brain, then what does that mean if you don't believe in the soul? If you don't invoke our spiritual nature and the transcendence, if you don't invoke real good and evil, a therapeutic doctrine becomes sinister at that point. It becomes a kind of suppression, not just of the social dimension, but also of the ethical dimension and the spiritual dimension. Of course, I mean, there are psychiatrists who recognize all these things, don't get me wrong, but I think there's a danger of those suppressions.
Yeah, so in that case, do you have hope for some kind of coalition between people on the left and right who are against the kind of neoliberal establishment to create some kind of path that involves real solidarity, real I don't know, something that's yeah, like can there be that kind of unity, that shared project?
Well, for a long time in Britain, I think people emerging from radical orthodoxy, along with other people, have tried to encourage just that kind of conversation, between conservatives who are genuine conservatives and believe in tradition and don't want everything undermined by money. And then on the other hand, people on the left who really believe in solidarity and the common good and an ethical dimension, perhaps backed by religion, and don't just believe in self-formation or a discourse of liberation and emancipation. In other words, that somehow when you've got rid of all the oppressive things, everything is fine. Instead of the idea that maybe, we have to work at molding, shaping, constructing a good human life, which after all is a much more labor-rooted idea, if you like. And there is a sense in which, the name of the British Labour Party distinguishes it from these discourses that are only about emancipation. And, a very long tradition of cooperation, of self-formation, trying to pursue a noble life in industrial communities, and a dignified life of artisanry, and so on, and a kind of despising, if you like, of just sheer individualism on the one hand, or sheer collectivism on the one hand. You see this in the working class masterpiece novel, Robert Trussell's The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, which is incredibly expressive of this attitude, the sort of dignity and creativity of labor as being what really matters. And I think we need to recover that. And I mean, I've just been writing about this, and I think it's interesting that you see both figures on the left, like Michael Lind and Adrian Pabst, but also figures on the right, like name is escaping me, but who are sort of rethinking the whole business of corporatism. And I think corporatism is becoming the key word, that, the idea that this is only associated with fascism, or only associated with an illegitimate power of business is I think, wrong. And that in many ways, the relatively good things about the post-war settlement in Britain and in America and on the continent were to do with some kind of alliance between government, business, and unions, that was sort of genuinely allowing business and unions some influence, but as a trade-off for an insistence that they have to contribute to the common good in some way. And I think what you could say now is that we have a very, very evil form of corporatism in the world. In other words, the big digital companies control everything. There's a hybridity between them and super states. And I think that the only way to probably break that power is to have a good form of corporatism. It's no good pretending that economic enterprises don't shape our social and political reality. And, the fiction that they're somehow politically neutral is very dangerous, because in reality, then they seize illegitimate political power. And we need much more a way of recognizing that political power is formed as a community of communities, as not just regions and localities coming together, but also working groups and various institutions of all kinds, including educational institutions. And instead of this market model of how everything integrates, by the hidden hand, we need a much more gift exchange model, that everything, we are all ultimately interchanging gifts with each other. And everybody, Gladden Papham was the name I was trying to think of. He's written a very fine article about this. I mean, people involved in the same kind of enterprise, beyond the elements of legitimate cooperation, they need to be grouped in some kind of professional association that's also to do with formation, so that they have some sense of the honor of what they're doing, and that profits are ultimately subordinate to social purpose. And I don't think any of this is utopian. I think it's much more that we need to redefine what gets you respect in society. I think people pursue respect and recognition. They don't, first of all, they're not primarily pursuing money and power. Most of all, people want to be in some sense admired or honored. And we need to play up the latter far more. So we need to build up both socially and legally the structures that give us a different kind of success. We need to call the powerful to account. That's the democratic element. But the other element is we're not going to we're not going to destroy the relative influence of more powerful people or elites. We need to reshape what that means, I think. And that's another way of saying that we need a sort of left-right harmony. We need more democratic participation, but we also need a sort of nobler sense of what it means to have power and influence, if you like. That's the more aristocratic element. And that's the kind of, certainly the kind of hybridity that I'm talking about. It's a kind of solidarism. Although, if you hear this on the left and you get alarmed, I think the upshot would be way, way to the left of anything that we've got now,
Yeah, no, because one of the things that concerns me, I see this in the US, I don't know how much in the UK, but what concerns me is that people have very limited categories with which they think about these social issues. Like, I see so many people who really just think it comes down to Democrat versus Republicans and the narratives that they put out there. And it's like, when you talk about solidarity, common good, when we talk about, state power, corporate power, this isn't on people's radars. They really think, at least in the circles I operate in, like people really think it's this simple dichotomy, this binary.
I think I think what we're ignoring here is, the whole sociological tradition, the Catholic social teaching tradition, even elements within Hegel, that because all our politics, in a way, assumes that we are isolated individuals, and the state is over against us. It treats us as isolated individuals with rights. And then if we're not being mediated by the state, we're being mediated by the market. And then the alternative way to look at that is to say, well, that's never true. It's always a lie. We're always already born into families, communities, business enterprises, educational institutions, and really the political formation is, if you like, a body of bodies. And in something I've just written, what I've said is that although that was initially a perception of the right against the French Revolution of people like Joseph de Maistre, it's very significant that Comte, Auguste Comte in founding sociology, he sort of accepts that perception, but he says, oh no, in the modern positivist order, it's only going to be science that will kind of integrate all these things. Science will be the new priesthood. But there's a sense in which Comte is absolutely right, both to see that we're always really in a corporate order, not in this kind of liberal order, and to see the necessary role of, if you like, a spiritual class, what Coleridge calls a clerisy within that order. That if you don't recognize the reality of that, what you get instead is the manipulators. You get, the quasi-clerisy, and that you get the dominance of media propaganda. And of course, in the last 20 years, that has been sort of undermined and yet confirmed by the total anarchy of the media. But it's no good complaining about misinformation and a crisis of truth if in reality you'd abandoned that search for a deep truth and what really binds us together, which, in the case of Britain, in the beginning of the BBC, which was pretty well founded by a Scots Presbyterian, that would, the reason why to this day the BBC has some sort of reputation is precisely to do with that kind of thing, that it thought of itself as a corporation with kind of spiritual responsibilities, and I mean, that has largely collapsed. But
because when I look at where people get this idea that it's this, very narrow dichotomy between two opposing sides, almost to the point that it's this Manichaean battle. It's the media.
I don't think it's like that, and I think that the sort of liberal versus post-liberal front has opened up, and with as it were, at a further extreme, national populism and so on. And I've very much tried to hold the line against going national populist, because I think it's always a risk with some post-liberals. But
yeah,
maybe the terrible things that are happening now are a moment, where Viktor Orban has realized maybe he isn't quite on the side of Vladimir Putin, is maybe a not kind of insignificant moment. But
yeah,
all the weaknesses that have risen in the West and that Putin and China have perceived are not, they're not suddenly going to go away, I think. And I totally agree. I think left-right thinking needs to be transcended, and it's significant that Michel, a French philosopher, has done very interesting work suggesting that kind of up to the 20th century, even socialism was not necessarily a left-wing doctrine. It was that, being a reactionary defined the right. You long for the ancien regime, or for a relatively conservative version of liberal democracy. And what defines the left is liberalism and republicanism. But the socialist focus on precisely on the social order and on the corporate order, which begins with Saint-Simon and carries on with sociological corporatists like Durkheim and Moos. This is in a way of itself a kind of third way, and viewed from that perspective, there's much more kinship with Catholic social teaching as a third way. And I don't mean a kind of Tony Blair Giddens sort of thing. Much more than might appear, and something like a sense of the radical center, which is in no way some ghastly kind of triangulation. And it's sort of questioning the whole terms of reference, the whole terms of debates that in a way, the French Revolution set up, and, to a lesser degree, the American Revolution.
yeah.
Why have other countries so readily accepted that, in a sense? Because often they've had their own evolutions towards something more democratic that have been more organic.
Yeah, no, and I part of it, I think, as you said rightly, is the narratives that are pushed on the media. But it's my other question though is like, why is there no curiosity to understand what's happening outside of these narratives on the media? Because like I look at very young people who, I mean, they're not watching traditional forms of news like, BBC, CNN, Fox, whatever. Like they're going on social media, they're going on TikTok, where it's very easy to just like, the algorithm keeps picking things that relate to what you're already watching. So it further confirms your narratives. But even for older people who watch traditional news sources, like I think the fact that there's no philosophical, even spiritual curiosity to understand, like, okay, so we associate one side with the good, the other side with the evil. Is this kind of construct reasonable philosophically, spiritually? Like, if we're not reading philosophy, theology, cultural criticism, if we're just watching these kind of commercial news narratives, or we're just going on social media for the younger generation, like we just become these I think we become robots. Like we're told a narrative, we just spew it out, we regurgitate it. There's no critical thought going on, there's no curiosity.
And this relates to this sort of transhuman danger that we're reduced to a combination of the robot and the animal, and we're dominated by a digitalized, medicalized discourse, and even all the choices we're offered are another means of controlling us, and so on. But I take out from the fact that so many bright people now see this kind of thing, and I think if you read, say, the pages of Unheard, you see just how many people see that, and how a lot of the most intelligent journalists are seeing that. And writing much more insightful things than we're getting in the mainstream press.
Yeah. So then I would want to close with a question just for young people who are disillusioned with everything going on, who do feel, again, this sense of atomization, existential kind of despair. What do you recommend? Where can young people begin to find hope in the midst of everything happening today?
That it's such an important question, and you could so easily give a trivial answer because people are in all kinds of conditions and facing all kinds of struggle, and all kinds of despair. But I would say, certainly look to nature. Look to art. Try and get back in touch with the rhythms of the day and night, the rhythms of the seasons. Try to not neglect the realm of the imagination, a sense of the symbolic. And then if you come even remotely out of a religious tradition, try and think about the way that may still echo within you. What are the deeper things in your own family legacy or the legacy of your neighborhood? And maybe then try to begin to explore that, and above all, help other people. Every time you help somebody else, even in a small way, it gives you a little bit of joy that's more than simply pleasure. I think, and any way you can build up human solidarity really matters.
Yeah, no, and I think, as you're saying, like, we have to be careful with this idea of helping other people, because for many it quickly becomes, post something on the internet or vote for whatever policy. But
no, try and do something concrete in real physical time. Completely go and talk to somebody in a cafe, talk to the beggar in the street. Absolutely don't minimize your staying online. Try and have an iron routine about that. You do it for, I try and post this on myself, and I don't keep it. I'm awful, but try and just do it once a day or something like that. Otherwise it's like a drug. And
it is. No, and it's that concrete communion which builds real solidarity, which can confront social issues. And that's where I think the change begins, in actual solidarity.
Look at what the people of Ukraine are doing. Look at what human beings are capable of, and it's partly because they have real living traditions that they're proud of, and that by the Ukraine is the most religious part of the former USSR. Something that people don't always realize, especially the west of Ukraine.
Good. Well, John, thank you for coming on. Is there any plugs you have to social media, to any of your writings that you want to share before we go?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, the last book I co-wrote with Adrian Patz was the Politics of Virtue, that tries to address some of these things. And I've got an article coming out about Catholic social teaching and some of the issues I'm talking about in New Polity quite soon. And I'm trying to finish my very long book on the gifts sometime in the summer.
Okay, great. Well, John, thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it.
It was really great to talk, Stephen. Thank you.